Ben Skinner, so good to see you, my friend. Where are we finding you today?
Great to see you, Justin. Long time, Brooklyn, New York.
I can't think of a cooler place. Let's pretend that you and I never met. Perish the thought.
Hmm.
And I know nothing about forced labor and supply chains.
Yeah.
Tell me what Transparentum does.
So Transparentum is really a distillation, which I actually just heard summarized by perhaps a mutual friend, but anyway, somebody that I've known for a decade or so, John Batiste, who said you have to confront the brutal reality while walking in unwavering faith. And those two very dissonant ideas, I think, are kind of encapsulated in what Transparentum does. The brutal reality part is the investigation. So we go in and do deep dive investigations into forced labor, child labor, and gross environmental, lethal environmental degradation overseas in corporate supply chains. And we go to the suppliers of brands and retailers. We go to their suppliers, to suppliers of suppliers of suppliers. We go all the way up. And we document at close quarter where those abuses are happening: forced labor, child labor, people who are forced to work, held through fraud under threat of violence. And then the walking in unwavering faith part comes in, where we approach the brands and the retailers first before we go to the general public, and we say, we're not going to take your money. We are entirely philanthropically funded, but what we will give you is time to analyze our investigation, to look at your supplier, to look up your supply chain, and to really understand where these problems are manifest, and to change the story before it goes out into the general public, before we talk to your investors, before we talk to regulators that can seize the products coming into the United States, before we talk to the general public, to your customers via journalists. And what we found is that about 75 to 80% of the companies that we engage with seize the opportunity, do the right thing, and get workers out of debt bondage. They change the operations of their supply chains.
So it sounds like you've got a carrot and stick operation at play, right? Like,
Sure.
and I don't think carrots work without sticks and sticks work without carrots. Generally, what's the response when you show a company something that they just had no idea was going on in their supply chain?
It runs the gamut. So take our first investigation, which is into leather tanneries in Bangladesh. There was a cluster of leather tanneries on the Buruganja River, just on the in what they call an upazal, or a neighborhood of Dhaka. And it was a residential neighborhood that had been overrun by over 150 textbook de facto de jure illegal tanneries, right? These were using chrome tanning, so chrome, cadmium, lead, going into the drinking water of some 500,000 people downstream. The average life expectancy for I should say, if you were working in those tanneries, 90% of those workers were dead by the age of 50. And a quarter of the workers, according to the World Health Organization, were under the age of 11 in those tanneries. And I could go in at the beginning of this investigation as a Westerner with an SLR camera and take photos of 7-year-olds cutting the edge off of rawhides with sharp razors with no protection, right? And what was so striking was when we began approaching the very large handbag retailers, the very large handbag brands, the very large shoe retailers as well. They had no idea that this was anywhere in their supply chain. We traced it through a supplier in Korea, and then to another manufacturer in Korea, and then to these companies. And the first response was, well, we don't think this is in there. And then when they dug a little deeper, they said, oh yeah, this is in our supply chain. It's de minimis. It's not that much, but 2 to 3% of your supply chain is still a very significant impact on those 500,000 people living downstream. And so the first response is kind of, geesh, we didn't know, most of the time. And then you get that once, right? You get that one kind of get out of jail free card. And then then you know, and if you know about it and you don't do anything about it, that's willful disregard. But if you know something about it and you work to fix it, that's called responsibility.
We talk about, I think you talk about in the book, the whole Stalin quote. We talk about it here often, that, the
Mhm.
death of a million is a statistic, the death of one is a tragedy.
Mhm.
You go into the tragedies, you tell the stories of people in your book, and you connect those to our everyday lives. And in one of those stories you talk about, and I'd love for you to walk through it here, just the time frame of like being able to leave New York. What is it, like 5 hours? In 5 hours
Mm.
from New York, you could be sitting with someone who is
Mm.
living in modern day slavery in Haiti. Can you kind of walk through that kind of like story, but also just the proximity of how this is to our everyday lives?
Yeah, so I'll walk through that briefly and then bring it to the reality that it's even closer than this. I mean, you don't have to fly to Haiti into the middle of what is teetering on the edge of being an out and out failed state in order to find human degradation and the exploitation of human misery to the degree where people can be bought and sold. And this was shortly after the 2004 coup. I flew to Haiti, and there was a place where I had been told, if you pull up on in a car, there will be people that will negotiate the sale of a child. And officially, this is what in Haiti they call the rest of X system. It's for domestic servitude, essentially. And in theory, it's in exchange for some schooling. So poor rural families send their children to slightly less poor urban families, and who give them some, in theory, shelter and food and education. In some cases, it almost looks like quasi adoption. In the vast majority of cases, according to the studies that I was building off of, it's exploitative. It essentially turns them into modern day slaves. But I would say, one thing I didn't do in the book, and I was inspired by you and others on this, was to really look at what was going on in the stuff that we buy, in the more and to really analyze the moral decision that all of us make when we hit confirm purchase, because it is so easy to take for granted that, oh wow, it's the price is down 14% on Amazon, I'm getting a great deal. Quite possibly, but remember that the cost that we pay is more than what appears on that line in your checkout, in your cart.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I moved on from the book and started reporting for Bloomberg Business Week, I had a new mandate, and that was to look at supply chains. And I was hugely intimidated by that, right? Because I could go in for Time Magazine before that and talk to, as I did in South Africa, crack dealers who were rolling their profits into selling young girls, and there was some physical risk for me while I was in theater, in that moment, but they weren't going to sue me for defamation afterwards. These
Right.
companies, these
Yeah,
companies, if you get
I
it
get
wrong,
it.
are going to sue you. So we were very, very careful to kind of have all of the T's crossed and all the I's dotted. If you give them the opportunity, as we do through Transparentum, to remedy the problems, they have immense power to do that. And here's my point. Consumers have that power as well.
Mm,
Investors have that power as well. So
mm.
all of us have the ability to interrogate the true cost of the products that we're buying, and to make sure that the brands and retailers that we buy from know that it matters to us.
I always say it's a great point. I always say compliance means I have to, responsibility means I get to.
Mm.
And we we all want to be part of a bigger story, brands included, and no one wants to be tied to a story of exploitation. No one. So I'm not
Right.
surprised that when you bring these stories, um, and they are stories, uh, that companies want to dig into, the mapping and the transparency and all the rest of it. And I will say, that I do remember you working on that story. It was in New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
For
The
Bloomberg,
first one for
the
Bloomberg. Yeah.
first one. Yeah, and it really cracked open. I think it was the first time I've ever heard of the term bill of lading, which
Mm.
literally I live in every day now. But it was the I'm like, what is a bill of lading? I'll have to Google
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
it was because of what you're saying, right? You were connecting the commercial dots to a
Mm.
story that no one wants to be associated with. And those connections, which we now call transparency or responsible supply chains and all the rest of it, how do we tell stories of parity? How do we see
Right.
commonality and connection? How can we do better as practitioners to tell stories of parity?
I am constantly learning year by year on this. And if you'd asked me 25 years ago when I started writing about modern day slavery, if I would still be reporting on it a quarter century later, I would say, sheesh, I hope not. But the truth is, you get renewed every year with a sense of possibility and purpose by the people that you meet, and none more so than the survivors of modern day slavery and the survivor leaders that step up on this. The thing that we miss when we overlook the potency and we wallow in the tragedy and we wallow in the pity, as you say, is this extraordinary reserve of energy, of potential, of people that have seen the worst of humanity and are determined to support and build out the best of humanity as a result of that.
Mm. You've written a few books, and probably the hardest thing to write for a book is the title. It's the
Mm.
billboard, right? It's the
Sure.
promise.
Yeah.
And words matter in books, but words really matter when it comes to writing a title. And for your book, uh, you called slavery a crime.
Mm.
That's a very different word than
Mm.
you chose to use the word crime.
Mm.
Why did you say that?
Well, the quote itself it's a great line from William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist from the 19th century, and he was talking about slavery as a crime so monstrous, a sin so God-defying that it casts into the shade all other distinctions among man.
Mm.
And that, I think, really summed it up for me when I would talk to people like Ganu Lal Kol, which is the name that I call somebody who was in bonded labor in a rock quarry in India, and he had been born into debt bondage. That the debt originated with his grandfather, as far as they could tell. It was a debt originally of 62 cents for the meager bride price of Ganu's grandmother, and three generations and three slave masters later, Ganu had to get up every morning and use his bare hands and pikes and mortars and hammers to turn rock that was pulled out of an illegal quarry in a protected forest into sand, into fine grade silica sand.
Mm.
And there's only one way in the quote unquote modern world that you can turn a profit off of handmade sand, and that is through slavery. And so crime on crime on crime in that equation. And yet, even though the local police in that particular district had known that the slave master of Ganu and his entire village was credibly accused of murdering several of the other workers. Those workers were Dalit. They were what used to be called the untouchable caste,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore their murders didn't even register.
Mm. Jeez. Well, Ben, how, what's your take? We've never had a chance to talk about this, but like, what's
Yeah,
your take on laws like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act here in the United
yeah,
States? Like, I'd
yeah,
love to get your sense. You had a wide angle view. You know, some folks are just coming into this, they're starting jobs. This is called the Responsible Supply Chain podcast. There are
yeah.
people that are just getting started in this, but you've got some depth. What
Mhm.
systemic changes have you seen at a government and corporate level, and what's your take?
We've made significant strides over the last 15 years. I would say, in the Bush administration, which had this brand new mandate on trafficking,
Mm-hmm.
there was I would say, a disproportionate focus on on commercial sexual exploitation. And in the Obama administration, there was really an attempt to rebalance that, to look
Mm-hmm.
at what the ILO and others were saying about where the balance of forced labor took place. And I give our friend Ambassador Dvaca a lot of credit here
Mm-hmm.
and of course his top deputy Allison Friedman, close friend.
Whoop,
Um,
whoop.
she said to him, what are going to be the elements of your legacy here? And one of the things that they mutually decided on was focus on getting forced labor out of American markets by getting it out of supply chains of major corporations. And at the end of the Obama administration, Congress closed this loophole in the 1930 Tariff Act. It used to say that forced labor was banned in products destined for our U.S. markets unless we couldn't make enough of that stuff in the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. to meet consumer demand. And think of all the things that slavery are in
Mm-hmm.
most of those things these days. And so Congress closed that loophole. Beginning of the Trump administration, they began to seize products. The first seizure was a shipment of soda ash and
Mm-hmm.
out of a prison labor camp in China, and it was seized coming into Newark. Um, and then you saw this crescendo, and Customs and Border Protection, with this mandate, really started to put companies on notice. Hey, if you have forced labor in your stuff, we're gonna keep it out of U.S. markets. And I would say that was a really helpful trend, that you saw kind of crescendoing until about 2022. And then the Uyghurs Forced Labor Prevention Act came in, and this is a good law. This is in no way a malign influence
Mm-hmm.
on policy here, but it did, I think, take a lot of the bandwidth of enforcement. And
Mm-hmm.
so in the last 2 years, you've seen somewhere in the order of 3.8, $3.9 billion worth of goods seized coming into the United States, supposedly with forced labor in its allegedly with forced labor in its production. But all of that, every penny of that, has been coming out of Xinjiang, and coming out of and seized under the UFLPA. Um, what I would love to see right now, and what I would love all of your listeners to get behind, and what I would love all of us in this community that cares about this to get behind, is a rebalancing of enforcement, so that
Mm-hmm.
it isn't a one horse town.
Yep.
There is forced labor in products coming out of India. There's forced
Yep.
labor in products coming out of Malaysia. There's forced labor in products coming out of most parts of the globe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And fundamentally, if the United States is going to walk the talk of protecting its markets from products made with forced labor and making sure there's no safe harbor for those products here in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
then we've got to enforce across all of these countries.
I couldn't agree more. And do you feel like, and it seems like, and we've seen the genesis of laws coming out of the California transparency law, and then the UK,
Mm-hmm.
and you're right. There's been a crescendo, not just on trade bans, but
Yeah.
also on regulations, where just, most companies, I don't know, above 500 million to, a billion in revenue, you've got one to many regulations to bear, and Europe's got, EU's got some coming down. It's interesting that the EU law, forced
Mm-hmm.
labor ban, that's coming into at some point in the next few years, it's indiscriminate of where it comes from. It doesn't matter if
Mm,
it's Western China or whatever. It's indiscriminate.
that's right.
Do you think here in the U.S. we're going to take it? We don't tend to take cues from anywhere
Mm.
in the U.S. But like, do you think that that's a good kind of like signal? Like, yeah, if the EU is going to be banning globally, that we need to get back to basics around that here in the U.S.
So, I mean, first of all, the law in the U.S. is quite clear that it doesn't
Yep.
matter where the products are coming from if it's got forced labor and it shouldn't be coming into our markets. So
Yeah.
it's just a question. It's just a question of enforcement. I would say the EU could take a cue or two from the U.S. in terms of how it was enforcing the law right up until about 2022,
Yeah.
and I hope gets back to enforce. I hold out faith. I know many of the people in the forced labor division of the Customs and Border Protection. I think they're going to do the right thing,
Hmm.
and start responding to many of these credible petitions, dozens of credible petitions that have been put in front
Mm.
of them by a whole range of organizations about forced labor and supply chains. I think that they're going to clear those hopefully quite soon. I would say the one thing that caught my attention on CSDDD, on this European law, this
Yeah.
EU law that
Yeah.
you mentioned, and I learned this actually, to be honest, for the first time last week. The penalties can be up to 5% of global revenue,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
For these
Yeah.
companies, fines of up to 5% of global revenue.
That's new.
5% of one of these
It's new.
companies. I mean,
Yeah.
that's beyond many of their profit margins, right? I mean, that would be
Yeah.
crippling. So if you're one of those companies, you have a massive imperative to at least map your supply chain and to put in place best in practice policies to get forced
Yeah.
labor out.
This is the reason why we started this show. At Freedom, we meet amazing folks in companies every day that have been handed this mandate to map, monitor, and mitigate forced labor in their supply chains. That that work is so massive. Like the requirements don't match capacity at a lot of companies. And even technology can only do so much because
Yeah.
these supply chains have been built not just with technology, but with commercial relationships, personal relationships. It's just a lot put together that all of a sudden they have to do this. But we call this the Responsible Supply Chain Show for a reason because we're here to help this new emerging workforce inside of these companies. Given all that you know, and given all that you've seen, and you're still learning, just like I am,
Mm-hmm.
what advice would you give someone who's just getting started, in the responsible supply chain role, in a responsible supply chain role?
It's such a good question. I think for me, the first thing to do is to map your supply chain and to really understand
Mm.
what the working conditions are likely to be at all tiers of that supply chain. And I know that
Mm-hmm.
sounds daunting, particularly if you're a company of significant size
Mm-hmm.
with manifold vendors all over the world. But there are a few areas that I would really focus in on. One of them is any areas that have low wage migrant workers in your
Mm-hmm.
supply chain. And these are areas where, as we've seen through our work in Malaysia, through our work in Mauritius, through our work in Indonesia, through our work in India, now our work in Taiwan, these are areas where oftentimes these migrant workers will pay recruiters in their home countries in many cases, exorbitant, oftentimes illegal fees,
Mm-hmm.
illegally high fees to get jobs overseas on the promise that they will be making orders of magnitude more than they find out that they're actually making when they get to those jobs. They have their
Mm-hmm.
passports taken away. They are oftentimes living and working in deplorable conditions. There's restriction on their movement. All of these things I'm listing are among the 11 indicators of forced labor that the ILO puts out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you've got a situation like that, you need to act to remedy it. Through our work in the first investigation that we did into these conditions in apparel factories in Malaysia, what we found was that the American Apparel and Footwear Association, the largest industry lobby group for apparel in the United States, they did the right thing, and they came together with the Fair Labor Association, the FLA, and they came up with a commitment to responsible recruitment that basically says no worker today, it says no worker should pay for their job. If they do, they need to be reimbursed, they need to be made whole. And in our engagements alone, we've seen millions of dollars going back, and most recently from the brands and retailers directly to those workers, but oftentimes the suppliers also contributing to those reimbursements. They have to have their identity documents returned to them if they haven't had them taken away, and they need to hold those identity documents. And critically, they need clear terms of employment in their own language before they leave home. These are really basic, simple standards that it is zero cost to put the policy out there. And to put that in your codes of conduct for all of your suppliers. That is kind of 101. And then enforcement of that, I think, requires knowledge.
Ben Skinner, thank you for coming on. I hope you come back.
Real pleasure. Anytime, Justin.